Okay, so just in the last 2 weeks alone, I was in a debate with at least 3 people over whether Jesus wore a robe. I've never run across this before in my life, in all the years that we've been saved, that Jesus didn't wear a robe. And
yes, we thought robe meant robe.
Yeah, exactly. We thought robe meant robe, but apparently they think that Jesus walked around wearing pants, right? Like not jeans, but the idea is that he wore some kind of breeches. And the word breeches in the Old Testament is described in Exodus 28, starting at verse 42. The breeches were what the high priest wore in the nation of Israel. Underneath the robe is what it was. So let's just take a look at that. Exodus 28:42 says, "And thou shalt make them linen breeches to cover their nakedness. From the loins even unto the thighs they shall reach." So the linen breeches, the purpose, it says, was to cover their nakedness, right? So that they wouldn't be exposed if when they're wearing the robe, it were to fly up, or if they're doing some work or whatever it might be. And it specifically says here that the breeches were going to go from the loins even unto the thighs they shall reach. So it'd be from the loins to above the knees, basically, is where the thigh ends. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. It was basically like underwear, of sorts that they were wearing underneath the robes. So what do you have, Marshall?
And earlier in that chapter, they talked about making the robe for the priest. So this was separate. I mean, in addition to the robe, they had these breeches.
Right.
And the argument is, we feel the natural reading is that the robe went over the breeches, whereas they say the robe was just a jacket.
Like a coat of some kind.
And the breeches was their separate pants.
So it would have been shorter. It wouldn't have been the long robes that went to the ankles like we would traditionally think of a robe, like you see in all the Jesus movies or the Bible movies where the men are wearing these robes. They say that it was too girly, that it was a dress that they were wearing, if that was the case?
Yeah.
Right.
And they say the breeches, which is a type of underwear in reality, they say the breeches were the outward pants like we wear today.
Right.
That's the debate.
Right, and even though Exodus 28:42 clearly defines the breeches as these shorts, the length of shorts, not pants, as they also say.
That's true.
Okay.
Also, if you look at Exodus 39:23, he says that, "And there was a hole in the midst of the robe, as the hole of an harbigan, with a band round about the hole, that it should not rend." So the top of the robe had a hole, so we know that it wasn't this type of coat. It was, you put it over your head, and there's a different verse where it said there's 2 holes here for your arms. So it was definitely like a traditional type of robe.
Right. So then their argument then is that it was sort of like a poncho, like a coat that would go up to your waist, a coat basically, not a robe.
That's
in
what
that
they
case.
say, yeah.
Right. So they're redefining the word robe out of whatever reason. They think that it's too girly to wear a robe, and so they change the definition
to a coat. They say robe means coat. The robe can't be a coat because there's verses that speak of the robe and coat at the same time.
Okay, that's right. So Exodus 29:5 talks about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, "And thou shalt take the garments and put upon Aaron the coat and the robe of the ephod." So what you're saying is that the high priest wore this ephod, which was the robe that's described. It says the robe of the ephod, but it also tells him to put upon Aaron the coat. So if it's really just a coat, that they would be wearing 2 coats then in this case, and that would be redundant language. Am I explaining that right?
Yeah, exactly. Robe can't mean coat because it says, "And put upon Aaron the coat and the robe." So there's already a word for coat. It's coat.
And we see that in Leviticus 8:7 also. "And he put upon him the coat and girded him with the girdle and clothed him with the robe." So it would be very redundant if the robe was just a coat like they claim to say, put on the coat and put on the coat.
Exactly.
Right? They're two completely separate things.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've established that.
And that brings us to the next point that you brought up, was that robes have skirts. Okay? And this implies that they were long. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, it says that then David arose, and 1 Samuel 24 verse 5, it says that then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. So this is when Saul was sleeping and David snuck up on him, cut off the skirt of his robe, and said, "Look, I could have killed you, Saul, but I didn't. I'm not going to hurt you. Why are you after me?" But the point being here is that he cut off the skirt of the robe. So robes have skirts.
Right, which makes perfect sense. And it's not the woman's skirt that people think about. It's not like the cut would have been different. It's not, made of this fine material that looks very feminine. It was a manly, thick robe in all actuality, right?
Right. Which brings up one of a lot of points is that a lot of their arguments that men couldn't wear robes, that robes couldn't be long, is a reaction to modern sensibilities.
Right.
Like today, Protestants or Baptists, they don't want to be associated with Catholicism at all. So they're like, oh, we can't look like a pope because a pope wears a long robe.
Right. And they call it the dress that they're wearing. And they kind of are the way that it looks. It's puffed out. It's, it's not natural. It's not the kind of robes that the Jews or Israelites were wearing, or Jesus himself was wearing. Weren't these big, puffy, long, super long trains that were on these robes. It would have been a more simpler garment, but nevertheless it was a robe.
Yeah, exactly. And we can't base our doctrine in reaction to what's happening in modern times.
Exactly.
We have to base it on the Bible, and Catholicism is a false religion, but every single thing that they do isn't wrong. They believe in the Trinity. The Trinity is true.
They believe in the virgin birth, and that's true.
Yeah.
Right.
So if the Pope wears a robe, that it's not a manly robe, but it doesn't mean that
it's definitely not a manly robe.
But it doesn't mean that there weren't long robes in the Bible that men wore. The other part of the idea of the skirt of Saul's robe. So the people that we're arguing against would say that a coat that goes to your waist or a little below your waist has a skirt. But that doesn't make sense. Skirts are associated with something long. And this next verse talks about that in Psalm 133:2. It says, "It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard, that went down to the skirts of his garment." So the idea here is that oil went from the top of Aaron, from his beard, to the bottom of Aaron, the skirts of his garment.
Right, so he was anointed from head to toe.
Exactly.
And that proves it right there.
Right, it wasn't from the head to his
coat
halfway down, right?
to the skirt of his coat.
Right.
It was right. So there's the common natural sense reading indicates that it was a robe that probably went to his knees. And that's the thing about Exodus 28:42, which describes the breeches going from the loins to the end of the thigh, which would have been the top of the knee. And so the assumption is that the robes would have gone from past the knee, either somewhere below the knee and down to the ankles, would have been probably the typical length. And they might have had both, Maybe there's a winter robe and a summer robe, that's an assumption, but it's safe to say that was probably the case. And the other thing, Marshall, that it reminds me of is when you talk about the skirt of his garments in Psalm 133, it reminds me of the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth, of Boaz and Ruth when they were getting betrothed together. And let me just turn to Ruth chapter 3 here. And in verse 9, Ruth 3:9, "And he said, 'Who art thou?'" This is Boaz speaking to Ruth. "And she answered, 'I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman.'" So she wanted Boaz to spread the skirt of his robe over her, right? Now, you can't spread the skirt of your pants if it was pants that they were wearing, right? There's no skirt in the pants. And it wouldn't have been the coat, because that would not have covered Ruth. And the reason we know that is Ruth chapter 3, verse 4. If you just back up a little bit, it says, "And it shall be, when he lieth down, that thou shalt mark the place where he shall lie, and thou shalt go in and uncover his feet." Okay, so the skirt of his robe was at his feet. Okay, and so that is definitive proof that Boaz was wearing a robe in the traditional sense that we think of. And then it says, "And lay thee down, and he will tell thee what thou shalt do." And this was a custom within the Israelites that signaled betrothal. This was the betrothal. This was the engagement. This was saying, we're going to get married. You know, they were beginning that relationship. So that's pretty clear.
Yeah. The husband is covering the wife. And in order to have a garment big enough to cover the wife, it can't just be a little part of your coat. It has to be a big robe that he was sleeping in, that was covering his feet, and that was capable of covering her.
Right. So there's no doubt that even in the story of Boaz and Ruth. And, you know, I remember when I was a child, I've been to places. This was back in Iran, you know, when I was like 3 years old or something, before we came here. And there is a place called Persepolis, and it's the ancient ruins of Persepolis, where Alexander the Great came in and he destroyed this entire city. And they had this castle, and on the ruins of the wall are etchings of pictures of the ancient people, which would have been about 300 BC. And in the etchings that are, you know, these ancient etchings on the wall, there are pictures of men that were wearing these traditional robes that we're talking about, that went anywhere from the knees down to, you know, the ankles. And so you can't fake the history of it, the fact that this was done. And I've seen it with my own eyes. This isn't some conspiracy thing, you know, I've seen it. And so there's all kinds of, you know, paintings and archaeological findings that show that men actually wore robes. And that's not, you know, that's a secondary proof. I'm not saying just base it on that. It's the Bible is our final authority, but we've proven it from the Bible and from history. So it's pretty clear cut. And just one thing I want to say too, we would never even be debating this if this doctrine had not come up. It's like before we heard of this doctrine for 20 plus years, we all assumed it was traditional robes. So this is really just coming from the teaching of one man, and it's not a big issue. Look, I'm not saying this is a big deal, but it just keeps coming up. So I thought, let's make a video about it and go over the verses and lay it out for people.
Yeah, and it's related to a bunch of other false doctrines that go along with it, like hating Sodomites instead of preaching to them, hating anything feminine. But these weren't feminine. Like, you showed me a picture of that ancient ruin, and those etchings of men in robes, they look like manly things. They didn't even look like popes. They looked like manly men.
They were manly, kind of like, you know, like the gladiators went into the battle with these robes, you know, and they had armor on, and it's a manly robe. I mean, it's not a skirt. It's just kind of a ridiculous argument to begin with.
Yeah, it goes back to the fighting against modern day sensibilities instead of just seeing what the Bible actually says. Like,
right.
In our culture today, only women wear
skirts,
and
as it should be.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there weren't manly robes that were worn at some time, and are still worn in other parts of the world.
Right, like the kilts of the Scots. You know, if you tell a Scot he's wearing a skirt, you're going to probably get beat up, right?
Yeah. Because theirs are kind of a little high cut too, though.
Yeah, they are. Sure.
And, you know, in Isaiah's vision of God, in one of Isaiah's visions, it says that God's diadem. Let me read the verse, Isaiah 6:1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. So the train is the extra part of the robe that keeps on going, and the train of the Lord's robe would fill the entire temple. And so the Lord, God the Father,
Yeah. In his throne room.
In his throne room, he's wearing a robe. Okay?
So that robe, the train of that robe is filling up the whole throne room, the temple.
So it's not a short coat. It's a long robe. It's a very, very long robe.
And so God was okay with that.
Yeah.
Because he's the authority. He's the king, right? And it symbolized royalty, didn't it, wearing a robe?
Yeah.
And that reminds me about, in Luke, the verse that they always bring up is Luke 20:46. And they say, well, it was the scribes and the Pharisees that always wore the long robes. And Jesus wasn't wearing robes, he was wearing pants, And let me just read you Luke 20:46. This is one of their main objections. Beware of the scribes, which desire to walk in long robes and love greetings in the markets and the highest seats in the synagogues and the chief rooms at feasts. So Jesus was warning against long robes and against the greetings in the markets and the highest seats in the synagogues. This was talking about the prominence that the scribes and the Pharisees wanted to have as they walked around, the temple in Jerusalem and the streets, saying, look at me, I'm the high priest, or I'm the priest, or the scribe. But the long robes that it's talking about here isn't the ones that went to the ankles. The implication is that the length of a regular robe went to the ankles or to the knees, but that the long robes were extra long. They were the ones like the train that filled the temple that we're talking about. And it was not their place to wear this extra long robe. They were just exalting themselves. And that's really what Jesus was rebuking them over.
And also, there's a couple of verses that we have where it talks about the robe being the only clothing that someone was wearing. In Job 29:14, it says, I put on righteousness and it clothed me. My judgment was as a robe and a diadem. So in this verse, using the KJV's built-in dictionary, clothed or clothed me is interchanged with robe. So like all this person is speaking of is being clothed in just a robe. So in order to be clothed with just a robe, it'd have to be the traditional, to the ankle robe. You can't just be to the waist coat, because then he'd be half naked.
Right, so he wouldn't just be wearing a coat, is what you're saying.
Right, you wouldn't just be clothed with half his body.
So we see the same thing in the book of Revelation when God's, we're going to be raptured and be in the throne room of God or in heaven with God. And Revelation 7:19 says, after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands. So they're going to be clothed. We're going to be clothed with white robes in heaven. And it goes along with what you were saying here, that it's just a white robe. It's not a coat. It's the only garment that it says we'll be wearing.
Right. Like in verse 14, it says that they washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So if a robe was just part of the clothing, it wouldn't say they washed their coats. Washed their robes. It says that they washed their whole clothing. So like that's all to back up what you're saying, that's all they were wearing was robes.
Exactly. And I have a feeling some people are going to get there and they're going to be like, what is this that I'm wearing? And they're going to want to go to the other place.
Wear a dress, no.
Okay. And so by implication, Jesus also wore a robe, because we see, for example, when they're talking about making the ephod, the robe of the ephod, in Exodus 28, it says, and thou shalt make the robe of the ephod all of blue, and there shall be an hole in the top of it, which you went over. But so it's talking about the robe there. And afterwards it says, and beneath upon the hem of it, thou shalt make pomegranates of blue, and of purple and of scarlet round about the hem thereof. So it's talking about the hem of the robe, right? And if you use the King James Bible Dictionary, we turn to Matthew 9:20, and there's this scene where this woman comes and touches the hem of Jesus's garment. And the implication there is that she is, reaching down and reaching the hem just trying to sneak by and just touch the hem of Jesus's robe.
Right, the least likely place where Jesus would notice her, just like the trail of his robe, that's trailing behind him, just like touching it and sneaking away.
Exactly, and it says that right there in Matthew 9:20. And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment.
It wouldn't make sense if you touched the hem of his short jacket or the hem of his pant cuffs.
Right.
It's more natural reading is that the trailing hem of his robe.
Right. And so the implication, whereas it doesn't say directly that Jesus wore a robe, but that's the implication. It's the plain, it's the natural reading. And then of course we saw, like you said earlier, God the Father in the temple, in heaven, in the heavenly temple, in the throne room, his robe covered. And of course that's Jesus also, isn't it? So pretty clear.
Yeah, amen. And the thing is, so Jesus wore a robe. He wore a manly robe. And God the Father on his throne, in the throne room, with the trail that goes throughout the whole throne room, God the Father wore a robe.
Right.
So these people that we're debating this issue with, they mock and ridicule and rail against the idea of Jesus wearing a robe. They say, "Oh no, Jesus didn't wear a dress. He's not a female." But that is the way he dressed. That is the way God the Father dresses. It's not effeminate. It's manly. It's manly. It's the
Right.
way they wore. They're mocking, inadvertently. They're mocking.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's why it's been bothering me so much, is because I'm like, why does this even bother me? Seems like such a small issue, but when it comes down to it, they're actually mocking Jesus. And it's unknowingly. I don't think they're going out to mock Jesus. I don't believe that. But but ignorantly or unknowingly, they are making fun of Jesus because he did wear a robe. So that's why it's important. That's why it's good to understand. And I hope this helped, because we did just throw this together on the fly. But I hope it helped you understand that Jesus did wear a robe and that men wore robes in the Bible.
Exactly. God bless.
Amen.